Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the HodlCast. Today is February 7th, and we have very special guest, Nelson Rosario. Nelson, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with Bitcoin?
Sure. And thank you for having me, Sasha, here on the HodlCast. I'm excited to kind of chat with you today about a variety of issues, but a little bit about me and how I got interested in Bitcoin. So I came to law as a second career. I used to be an election official at a local government office in Florida, actually, the Leon County Election Office. I was there while my wife was in grad school, and I knew I was going to be going to law school. But I realized I was really interested in technology, and so I, at the time, had a degree in history and political science, and so like every other lawyer, and I realized I was really interested in tech, law, society, kind of how all of it interplayed, and so I started looking for legal jobs that kind of fit that profile, and I somewhat mistakenly thought, oh, I should become an intellectual property attorney, deals with technology, et cetera, et cetera. I need a technical background. So I went back to school, got a second degree while I was working in computer science. And so I was basically, as soon as I finished that up, I then started law school here in Chicago at Chicago Kent. And it was 2012 when I had emails from then from classmates basically making fun of me as being the annoying Bitcoin guy. So apparently I was already like really interested in it. And I do remember kind of thinking and feeling like, well, this doesn't work. How does this possibly work, right? Like this doesn't make any sense. And I was familiar with file sharing and peer-to-peer systems and whatnot, just with my CS background and, having been on the internet for a while at that point. And so I kind of maintained interest, like 2013, I looked into, and of course didn't have time because I was in law school, but looked into, well, how do you do mining? Didn't do any of that because, I'm still working. So it wasn't until 2014 where my interest really crystallized and I realized, okay, this is the next big thing. I don't fully understand it, but I want to try and incorporate this into my career going forward. And what happened was I was writing a seminar paper in my last semester of law school on trying to spur economic growth in the developing world and using internet-connected smartphones for that purpose. And I kept reading about people using Bitcoin in the developing world in Africa, and I was just like, this doesn't make any sense. Like there's no financial infrastructure, and yet they're using this like cutting-edge technology. And my professor challenged me to a debate because he thought Bitcoin was BS. And so, like many things in life, out of the sheer terror of being embarrassed and made to look a fool, I did a huge deep dive, and I was just like, I want to learn as much as I can about this. And so that was kind of started my interest in Bitcoin. But as far as kind of what do I do on a day-to-day, so I'm a co-founder of Rosario Law with my partner Zach, and we're a kind of boutique intellectual property law firm. We handle patents, trademarks, copyright, trade secret, but then we do a lot of transactional legal work, kind of the nuts and bolts agreements that tech companies have to deal with to just kind of run their business. And in a sense, we kind of operate as outside general counsel. So yeah, I guess that's about it.
Very good. And what's something about you that not everyone may know?
So I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I tweet about that every now and then, and it's probably the most meditative thing that I do. As you know, like running your own business is very stressful and chaotic and everything else. And when you're on the mat and you've got like a 250-pound dude trying to choke you out, well, you can't really think about anything else, right? You kind of enter like this Zen state where you really have to be present in the moment. So, yeah.
I actually joined an MMA fighting dojo about 6 months ago, but I twisted my ankle and I haven't been back since October. So it was a good like 3 months of practice, and then I just kind of got out of the habit. But
yeah, ankle sprains are not to be taken lightly. Long ago, I was a sprinter, and that's actually why I went to college initially, was to run track.
oh, nice.
And So any injuries in the legs like make me really jumpy.
Yeah. I tried last night though for the first time a trapeze class, like flying trapeze. I saw Cirque du Soleil in Vegas like a month ago, and I thought, oh, that looks like a lot of fun. And then it is. I think that's gonna be my new thing. But,
There's briefly there's a trapeze school along the lake along Michigan here in Chicago, and I always see people there just flying through the air when I'm like running along the lake. But
nice. And so how can you tell us kind of how the IP law fits into the cryptocurrency space?
well, sure, but can you maybe refine the question a
Well,
little bit more?
yeah, so I guess we've seen a lot of patents coming out of the banks, and I think the one study showed that China has an awful lot of patents as a country around the Bitcoin space and other blockchain technology stuff. So, J.P. Morgan, I think last year put a lot of effort into their patents, and yeah, so maybe you could just talk about what some of those are, if they're how do I word this right? If they're good or bad for the open source industry, maybe we could start there.
Yeah, so maybe let's start with kind of like the fear that's maybe the subtext for the
Okay.
community behind that question, and there is a lot of anti-patent sentiment amongst the programming community writ large, right? Especially in Silicon Valley and elsewhere and everything else. There's very valid reasons for that, right? The patenting process is expensive. It takes a long time. And then sometimes, the product or the system or whatever else has moved on to different generations, and it's kind of not even necessarily covering what's offered on the market at that point. But I gave a talk back in 2016, actually, on blockchain and patents. And one of the points in the talk, and it was like a short kind of, I think 12-minute talk or 14-minute talk, but one of the points I stressed is that in many ways, we've kind of already seen this story before. And the analogy I liken it to is with the development of the internet. Initially the internet was more or less a joint kind of project developed by academics and the military and a little bit of industry. And it kind of stayed that way until, it started to become commercialized and web was born and all of that stuff. And the internet functions on open source protocols, right? Everybody has to be speaking according to the same rules. Otherwise, because computers are dumb and they can only do what you tell them, if you don't have the same protocol, they can't exchange information, right? So there's a common set of open source protocols and software that is the kind of underlying architecture of the internet. But the reality is, and I've worked on a lot of networking protocols, patents, is like there's also a lot of patents on all of that technology. And so it's not like the internet didn't become this all-encompassing data sphere that's surrounding the earth at this point. I think that some of the fear behind patents in like a new emerging technology, and I think Bitcoin Magazine ran an article on this in like 2017. It's like the coming blockchain patent wars. The kind of cold hard reality is that patent lawsuits are extremely expensive, and they're not really worth waging unless somebody has money. And short of like the exchanges and kind of maybe a couple other sets of companies, not a lot of businesses in the space have a ton of money where they're necessarily attractive targets for patent lawsuits. So, there's a consortium that is trying to get like mutual licensing agreements in place so that people can avoid getting sued for patent infringement in this new space. And I just think it's a bit early. Now, maybe it is a right kind of preventative medicine for the industry to be taking as a whole. But, you only really see patent wars once an industry has kind of fully matured. And then, it kind of becomes some sort of part of the corporate logic of trying to defend territory. Does that kind of answer your question more or less?
It does, yeah. And for people that aren't familiar with patents, it's always been kind of like an area of law. I mean, I didn't take a course in it in law school, and it's always been something I've studied it a little bit because I had one company that through outside counsel was going through the patenting process, but that was the only only aspect of it that I've learned about. But can you tell us, like, what does it take to get a patent, and what kind of technology is able to be patented?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, your idea has to be new, right? Nobody can have come up with it before. You can't patent, laws of nature, abstract ideas. It has to be something that's kind of tangible and can be implemented. It has to have some sort of utility, and it can't be, obvious that somebody would have come up with it. There's more strict kind of legal language and everything else, but that's the basic gist, right? A lot of people think that like inventions are these eureka moments, in the bathtub, and that's not the case. There's maybe only a couple of like patent applications I've drafted where I was like, wow, this is really like mind-blowing technology. The reality of innovation is that most of it is gradual. It's building on top of what people already did. So, a patent can be thought of as what's known as an exclusionary right. So it's not really like a positive, proactive right. It doesn't let you practice your invention. It lets you prevent other people from using it. And the trade-off is if you file a patent with a national office, the US Patent Trademark Office, you get a period of time, 20 years from the date of filing, that you can prevent other people from practicing your invention. You can prevent them from doing a couple other things as well, but that's kind of the gist of it. And so, what some people don't like is that, and this is in the blockchain space, and going back to what you said about kind of banks and other things, is oftentimes large companies with big R&D budgets and everything else will file lots of patents on potential product lines, things that they may be building or services, but they never actually implement. Okay, but they still end up owning that intellectual property right. And so, people are afraid of, they're building these big companies, like, well, they're never going to actually use anything in blockchain, but they're going to have all these patents, and then if a small competitor comes up, they can then sue the small competitor. And that's a valid fear to a certain degree, but I do think it's slightly overblown. I've written a couple of articles on kind of the blockchain patent landscape. The very first companies that were filing patents in the space were actually gaming companies, like Vegas gaming companies, because they thought, oh, well, we should let our players gamble with Bitcoin, right? We should have design machines that can accept it, and then they can use it. Then not long after that, the banks moved in, the financial institutions, because, think of the logic, right? It's like, well, we should probably hedge. Like, if this really takes off, like, we should already have started to move into the space. After that, insurance, then kind of the floodgates sort of opened up in logistics, supply chain. So, you need to have an idea that nobody's ever thought of before. And oftentimes people will be like, oh, well, we don't have anything patentable because, we took these three things that are off the shelf or standard approaches and we combined them. Well, the reality is, like, the combination, you may be the first one that's ever done that, right? And that can meet the standards of patentability. And so, it can be an expensive legal spend for startups, especially.
Yeah, how much does it cost to take a patent from start to finish all the way through?
From start to finish all the way through, it'll probably be between $20,000-$25,000 when you total up attorney's fees and then fees to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Mm-hmm. It may be less, it may be more. It depends on the complexity of the invention. So between my partner and I, we've drafted probably close to, I would say, 75 or so blockchain patents. I drafted quite a few before I went out and joined Zach at a previous firm that I was at. And we have, a couple of clients that we work with that we've drafted patent applications for in the kind of blockchain crypto space. And so it's just one of those things that it is what it is, and it does take time and money. But it's kind of like going to the dentist and like following all the dentist recommendations, right? Like, all of us, we know, like, yes, I should be flossing twice daily. I should be going to the dentist every 6 months. But we don't all necessarily do that, right? And it's also one of those things, like, with legal services where people are like, oh, why did we do this? Like, it was expensive. But then if they find themselves in a situation down the road, they're like, oh, I really wish we would have done that, right? Plus, with kind of one last point is, with the big companies, a patent or a patent portfolio can be one of their more effective tools to fight off, we'll just say one of the big tech companies ripping off their idea and rolling out a product or service that's exactly what they're doing. That's an asymmetric relationship, but since you have a right that is recognized by the United States government, and once your patent application actually issues, it's presumed valid, and so now they all of a sudden have an uphill kind of, they then have to fight your patent if it's found that you're infringing, and so.
Mm-hmm. And it probably makes the company more valuable when they go to sell, if they ever want to sell or anything like that. It's certainly an asset.
Yeah, it definitely can be. And of course, there's, varying theories amongst investors, and some investors really care to see that. Other investors don't, it depends on what the business play is, right? If it's something where you're just trying to grab as much market share as possible and keep the team lean, then it's probably less of a concern. And to be honest, Zach and I counsel people to not file applications a lot of time because, at the very beginning, especially, you're often very resource constrained, and it's just not necessarily the best use of your time.
Mm-hmm. And if someone, so is there, if they put their technology on GitHub or something like that, does that stop it from anyone else patenting their idea? Like, they're putting it out in the open, and then no one else could at least, stop them from using their own product down the road?
Theoretically it could. The practicality of it is case by case, in terms of, did anybody even see it? Do they even know that somebody stole the idea? Can they prove that, what is in the patent actually reads on, what they did? And there are processes that people can go through to try and invalidate patent applications. But again, those are, can get quite expensive and everything else. So, but that's a concept kind of called defensive publication, and some companies employ that. It's not terribly common, but the idea is kind of like you get that out there, and then if anybody files something on a related concept, an examiner at one of the patent offices should see that and use it like, oh, that's not a new idea. You took that from this. That was, GitHub should be an excellent source of prior art, but one thing that people don't know about the patent office here in the U.S. is that it's actually revenue positive, and instead of being able to use that revenue to kind of like improve the patent office, Congress just always takes that money, and so it's like even more resource constrained, and so examiners are under a lot of constraints to get things done efficiently as possible, and so they don't necessarily, most of what they look at are prior patent documents, okay? There's a set of what's called non-patent literature that sometimes gets cited, and really good examiners will bring in like academic papers published in IEEE, and they're like, no, you're doing what they do in these paragraphs here, this isn't new. I know that there's been attempts to, I think Stack Overflow actually had a program, a collaboration with the Patent Office, where they were trying to get people to submit prior art through there. I don't know if that's still ongoing. It's been a while since I looked into that. But, I guess, does that answer your question?
Yeah, you have a wealth of knowledge on this, so thanks for sharing.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And then what about Craig Wright's patents? I know, or even like, didn't he try and copyright the white paper at one point? Or
yeah, so supposedly he did register himself as the author of the white paper with the Copyright Office, but which that only shows that he is saying that he is the author of the white paper, right? The Copyright Office doesn't like check that what you're doing is right or accurate. So it's not really necessarily indicative of anything beyond that, right? And it's been pretty interesting, I think, to follow the Kleiman case in the sense of watching just the leaps of logic and kind of all these weird just shifts and everything that he's been pulling without just being forthcoming, or just at least saying like, oh no, this is exactly what it is, and you can draw your own conclusions from that. The end chain patents, I thought about this a lot, and it wasn't until recently that I thought, if all of these things actually issue as patent applications, okay? So I think the last I saw, they were like, oh, we have like 800 or 666 patents or something like pending, right? Some of those have actually issued and become patents. There's a bunch of apparently pending patent applications. But the one thing I thought of was like, that's really expensive, right? Like, because each one of those patents was probably, on average, let's say $10,000, like easy, maybe up to 15,000, depending on how complex it was, what firms they're working with. And so, you start doing the numbers in your head and you're like, well, that's adding up. And then you think, okay, well, that doesn't even factor in the fees at all the different offices, because it's not like they've only filed in the United Kingdom. They filed in the US, they filed other places. And when you start talking about international protection, the fees go way up beyond just filing in your own home country. And then you think, okay, well, if they all issue, how are they going to maintain it? Because you have maintenance fees that you have to pay at 3 years and so on. And after that, there's 4 different periods. And if they're going to be maintaining in multiple different countries, just the sheer coordination costs of all of this is just like, I mean, there are people that think they're positioning themselves to be kind of the preeminent patent troll or whatever you want to say in the blockchain space. And, that's certainly an argument that you can make, but it's not going to be cheap for them to do all of this. The way patent trolls really kind of work in the US and other places is they buy patents super cheap that are very broad, and then they send demand letters to tons of companies, right? And they're very sophisticated about the economics of it, in that they make the demand just nuisance level, where it's like it's worth their while, but it's not. You're like, I don't actually want to file a lawsuit. We'll just pay them to go away, right? And so. This is a different situation where like they've been building a portfolio from scratch, and like it's not like they just bought all of this stuff. And I'm sure that probably a lot of those applications could be invalidated because they're maybe based on ideas that have been common in the space for quite some time. So I don't know how it's really going to shake out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Yeah, I hope he doesn't become a giant patent troll. But I think if he will, the community's so innovative that they'll figure out a way around him too.
Yeah. I mean, there are processes that can be started by third parties to try and invalidate these things. And, if you put forward good prior art that shows, oh, we have this document or this code base and it means this, and that's exactly what they tried to claim in their patent here,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's probably what it will come down to, I guess. And then, so can you also tell us a little bit about your opinions or I guess experience in voting, and how if you think that there's any application for blockchain voting?
Yeah, happy to. That was part of, I guess in 2014, I'm someone of what maintained and solidified my interest in Bitcoin, is because I thought, oh, well, voting is a double spend problem.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, that's true. But the reality is elections are, I would say, maybe the second most complex problem domain in technology after identity. And part of the reason is the election world is really bifurcated in 2 different worlds. It's voter registration, and then it's the actual casting of votes. And so I worked at the supervisor elections office in Leon County for a little over 3 years, and that covered 5 federal elections. So the 2008 presidential, a couple of primaries, presidential primaries, etc. And I worked in absentee balloting for a while, and then I worked in voter registration, where we actually maintained the voter rolls, did voter outreach and everything else. And so I think that blockchain is a potentially really good tool for the voter registration side. And I can kind of explain why, but I think for the actual voting side at this moment, it's not a great idea for a variety of reasons. I'm a big advocate of voting on paper ballots that can be optically scanned. That technology is pretty thoroughly vetted. I mean, if I had my dream, all voting machines would be run on open source software. There would be much more open kind of auditing of what it's done right now, which typically someone with the Secretary of State in the state where machines are trying to get certified, someone from their office will be involved, somebody from the company, maybe supervisors in Florida, but that's it. It's kind of behind closed doors and everything else. And, voting should be free and fair and open, and we should know that the tools we're using are secure, right? If you don't follow Matt Blaze on Twitter, he's a great person to follow for this. He's a computer science professor at Princeton or something, and he's always talking about voting because he's been kind of a consultant to the voting industry for a long time, and frequently talking about how blockchain voting is a terrible idea. There's an XKCD kind of comic that talks about it as well. But one of the main reasons it's a terrible idea is, at least at this point, and maybe this changes with zero knowledge proofs, I don't know, I haven't seen anybody try and go that route just yet, but is, in my mind, the secret ballot, and which means no one knows how you voted, is like cherished. We should do everything to preserve that. And so it gets really difficult then if you have a public ledger that tracks every single transaction, right? Mm-hmm. And I know people, I forget who you said has been using a token-based kind of voting system.
I think West Virginia, Colorado have implemented them.
Yeah, that's Votes. So I've been following them for a while. And, they say they're a blockchain-based voting system, but they're a blockchain-based voting system in the same sense that tracking tomatoes on the IBM blockchain is a blockchain system, right?
A database.
Votes, right. Votes controls the chain, and they have done trials with a particular subset of voters called the UOCAVA voters. That's the Uniform Overseas Civilian Absentee Voting Act, and that's so that service members that are deployed, expats that are living in Panama, they're still U.S. citizens. They should be able to vote, and so they're able to vote by different means than like you and I. And so apparently the trials they did were specifically just for deployed service members, at least in West Virginia. I'm not sure on the recent Colorado trial. Experimentation is good. However, there are just, I think, kind of certain critical infrastructure type things where you have to be very, very careful with the experimentation that you're doing. Like, you don't see people, running, like startups running trials on like nuclear reactor controllers. It's just something, it's like, okay, we got to be very, very sure that we do this right. And so I just think that, to my mind at least, nobody has really put forward something that can kind of solve the technical problem, the political problem, right? Because do people even want this? Would politicians even want something like this? The cultural problem of kind of like, well, how exactly are we going to get, our grandparents to figure out how to use a system like this? How are you going to manage the user experience so that's something that everybody who's eligible to vote can do? And then also the legal problem, like, how are you going to design it so that you're in compliance with all of the election laws and making sure that, it's auditable and, people can actually see that, okay, this election was fair, instead of just making it even more of a black box than in many ways it already is.
And yeah, I always wonder, and I guess I could have looked into this more, but how the mechanics of it work. I've done voting on the blockchain with Counterparty in this kind of an online game called Bitcoins, and you vote for who you want the foundation to be. And it's very simple. Like the like creator of the game gives everyone a token, then they cast that token to the wallet address of the person that they want to vote for. But everyone knows who's voting for who if they know your address. So how, I wonder, would they solve that? And is that how they do it in the blockchain voting for these states, or how you know, I guess that if you're saying that it's just a database, they don't actually have a token to send around anywhere.
Yeah, I don't think that they do, at least, and you know, it's possible I missed that somewhere in like the votes press releases or looking at the things I saw, but I don't think they use a token. So I'm not entirely clear. You know, I've thought about this a lot, and I think you could probably design some sort of system where once somebody shows up at the polling place to vote and checks in, if you can separate their identity, their check-in, the identity and check-in kind of moment,
Mm-hmm.
and so that they're then anonymous once they're kind of in the voting world, okay, fine. But separating it and making sure that there's no way you can correlate those two is not a trivial problem, right? I think voter registration works because like we need to know who's registered to vote, right? So it's okay if we know that you're registered through a blockchain. And the other thing too is it could be potentially more resilient because there's something called the Motor Voter Act, which was passed during the Clinton years, I think. And that's why like you can register to vote when you get your driver's license, right? So you could have like the election offices, the county clerk's offices, every driver's license office. Those could all be nodes that are maintaining a voter registration role, right? And they could connect up, you know, at the county level, which is where elections are generally administered in the United States, all the way up to every county could connect to every state, you know, broadcast transactions. That would go a long way to kind of, and this is again just the technical, right? So you move from Florida up here to Chicago, and you know you register to vote. A transaction gets broadcast, it propagates through the network. All of a sudden, your election office in Florida now knows, oh, Sasha's no longer registered here. She just registered in Chicago. They can cancel your registration. The way the system works right now, by and large, is like you go and register in a new state, and you put down your previous address, and then they send a cancellation notice to your old election office, and then they're supposed to cancel you. Obviously, that's a manual process that is not perfect, right? But kind of, and sorry, I'm going on a tangent on elections here. You know, I spent a lot of time in it, and it's kind of one of those things that like, once you do it, you can't really get it out of your skin. And so the problem is, you know, elections here in the United States are decentralized. There's over 10,000 jurisdictions that administer elections in the US. Most people don't realize that, right?
And, that is an awful lot.
Right, yeah, and actually I was teaching a class out in Silicon Valley last May, and I had these foreign students that were lawyers from Europe and South America, and we talked about voting, and they were like, wait a minute, you don't have just like one national voting office? Like, wait, you don't have a national ID that you just, I was like, oh, let me tell you about voting here in the US. No, the states by, you know, the Constitution and other laws are able to run elections the way that they want to. All the feds can do is say, all right, well, for Congress and president, you have to meet these certain standards. And so by and large, the states will have their standards meet that. But then sometimes they do other things, you know, and so trying to get that, you know, we don't have a top-down system. So how are you going to get all 10,000 jurisdictions using the same thing, right? It works for something like Bitcoin and crypto and everything else because people are economically incentivized to do it. But, you know, what are you going to raise taxes? Well, nobody wants to raise taxes really ever. And you're going to raise taxes for the election office? Well, I hate voting. Like, why would I want that money going there? You know, so there's just all sorts, the incentives are all out of whack.
Oh, thank you.
Sure.
What about biometrics? Do you think that is something?
Well, that's a terrible idea. I mean, that kind of solves some of the identity concerns, right? Verifying that people are who they are, right? So I guess if you, again, probably some open source solution that was robustly checked by the community. You know, there's a principle in computer science that all bugs are shallow with enough eyeballs on them, right? So if enough people reviewed this, theoretically you can get to bug-free software. But yeah, if you're storing biometric data of people, like, well, that's a huge honeypot, and you know, who knows what will happen with that data. And by the way, this, again, going back, it's county workers who, you know, some of my coworkers were fantastic, some of them were not. And so now they're going to be handling, you know, super sensitive data. I mean, they already handle social security numbers, you know, and that's pretty sensitive as is. And so, you know, it's just not, I guess it's part of like a larger theme of like everything is being digitized, and we aren't really pausing to be like, well, let's work through like worst case scenarios here and try and make sure it's like, no, you got to get to market as fast as you can and grab as much market share and everything else be damned. And it's like, well, sometimes there's consequences to that, you know?
Yeah. I remember just being nervous the first time putting my thumb into Apple. I was like, oh, I don't know if I like giving this thumbprint, but now they have, you know, mine and a lot of other people. So they could almost do the biometrics for the voting, probably half the country.
Yeah, I mean, Apple, to Apple's credit, that's one area, user privacy is one area where they have been really good. You know, I don't know if you remember with the San Bernardino shooter, the FBI wanted Apple to build basically a backdoor into their encryption because it couldn't access the shooter's phone. And Apple was like, no. And the government sued them and they're like, so what? And Apple ended up winning. Now I'm pretty sure the FBI got like a third party to actually get them what they wanted. But, you know, that's not exactly as common of a stance as we maybe would like to see, especially as kind of privacy concerns just grow and grow every single day.
Yeah. And so shifting gears, I guess, I read an article in the American Banker where you were quoted discussing the JP Morgan coin. And, you know, that was like everyone was talking about it around, I think, like maybe this time last year or a little bit longer ago. And I haven't heard much from it. Obviously, it hasn't come out yet. Do you know what's going on with that now? Or?
No. And yeah, I haven't heard any, just like you, I've heard nothing about it since then. I remember that conversation at the time, though. I think with Penny Crossman, I was like, and I think she quoted me as saying, you know, we're heading to a nightmarish hellscape where every single company has their own token. Because, you know, that kind of already happened with rewards points, right? It was like, remember we had the little dongles on keychains and it was like, oh, wait, I don't have the thing. And it was like, you have 20 of them and it was just kind of, right. And, you know, do we really want that? Now, of course, you know, with crypto, there's wallets that can support multiple coins and everything else, but then you're relying on wallet. You know, it just sounds awful, right?
Yeah.
So it could be the case that JP Morgan coin is dead and they just realize like, this isn't worth it. It's not going to actually get us anything. It could also be that it's still ongoing. I mean, JP Morgan's one of the biggest companies on the planet. It's not, generally speaking, the case that things move super fast for a large organization, private or public. It's just, that's just not the way the world works, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't want to have to, you know, go into Gap and paying Gap coin and then fill up my car and pay BP coin, which I can exchange for Chase coin when I, you know, withdraw money from an ATM, you know, like, no. And maybe I'm in the minority there. You know, that's one of the things about tokenomics is a lot of people think like, oh, we can incentivize all of these ideas. And to a certain extent, you know, I teach a class and one of the things that we talk about in the class is that, you know, on blockchain, cryptocurrency, and law. And one of the things we talked about is like, there's potential here because this is a coordination technology. It can incentivize people. And every time we've had breakthroughs in very new coordination technologies, usually there's an economic boom that follows in history, right? And so I totally believe that there's something to this idea of tokenization and everything else. But I mean, we aren't even in the first inning. Like the game hasn't even really started in many ways, you know?
Yeah, yeah. What are your students? What are they like? Do they come in being like, "Oh, Professor Rosario, we love Ripple," or like what kind of things?
I'm trying to think if I've ever had a student ask me about Ripple. I don't think so. I've definitely had students snicker about Ripple at times, but the students have been amazing. I think we've had like 150 students now at this point.
Oh, wow.
They're all law students by and large, of you know, a couple exceptions. Some LLM students, which are foreign lawyers that are in the U.S. trying to get licensed in the U.S. And but they come really from all walks of life. Like you would think initially that it would all just be tech people. It's not. Like people that want to go into like do social work or elder law, or it's just kind of all over. It's maybe, as my co-professor Dan puts it, it's like the only law school class where like the anarchists, the communists, and the hardcore libertarians are all in the same class together, and they're all like excited about the same thing. It's very bizarre, but you know, we initially came up with the idea of the class in August of 2017. pitched it to the school, and then we announced it in the beginning of November of 2017.
Oh,
And as
wow.
you might remember, there was
Yeah.
some stuff going on at that time, right? And it actually, well, I'm sure you've felt similarly. I remember that whole year, I was just like, what is going on? Like, this is crazy, and I owned some Bitcoin at the time, but it was just kind of like, oh, whatever, I'll just buy some and kind of buy some and not really think about it. And then all of a sudden it was like, but so we announced, right in the middle of the bull run, or right when it was really taking off. And so we had 58 students sign up the very first time we taught the class, which was January. Yeah. And I was like, and I had never taught a class before. And I was just like, and so it was actually like the biggest elective. I think it still is the biggest elective at the law school at Chicago Kent where we teach. And but the students are very excited and very interested. And, one of the things that we try and impress upon them is like, you may think that you don't need to worry about this. Oh, I'm going to go into divorce law. I don't have to deal with it. Well, guess what? It's pretty close to the point where it's almost malpractice for you not to ask in, a divorce proceeding, okay, do you own any cryptocurrency? Like that's just going to become standard practice. It's also, you're seeing it show up in criminal cases too, when they're trying to figure out the financials of convicted and everything else. And so, or the accused and trying to freeze assets and all that stuff. Like, it's going to touch the technology in various ways. It's going to touch a lot of things, a lot more things than people realize, I think. If we get to a point where, like, the big local grocery store chain here is called Jewel-Osco. If we get to a point where Jewel-Osco is somehow using Bitcoin or blockchain, then it's in the background so far that, like, no one even knows, then it's mainstream, right? Mm-hmm. That's kind of the metric I think of. I don't think we're going to get there for a while, if ever. But yeah.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the grocery store. I thought that Whole Foods and Amazon, like, I've read online that they accept Bitcoin, and I never, anyway, I went yesterday and asked just out of curiosity, and the lady's like, I thought Bitcoin was dead. No, we don't take that. But then I saw on, like, there is somewhere where it says that Whole Foods and through Amazon, I think there's some, it's like the Purse wallet, or there's some like thing you have to do to.
Oh, yeah.
But I was just seeing if they knew about it or anything, and they didn't. But I think Walmart is using blockchain on their lettuce, in their.
Well, I think they're using IBM's blockchain as a service, right? So like IBM, Accenture, maybe Deloitte have all like rolled up blockchain as a service, which that's fine. Apparently. In like
those are the tokenless ones, like it just,
yeah, they're the tokenless ones where it's like IBM's running, it's on IBM servers, they're running everything, they control everything. I'm very much of the viewpoint that what's novel here, what didn't exist prior to Bitcoin, is now we have unique digital property that is censorship resistant and a value transfer vehicle. Mm-hmm. That just that simply did not exist before Bitcoin came along, right? And I don't know what that means, like, I don't think anybody really knows, and anybody who's like certain they know exactly what's going to happen, like, they may be right, but I think they're kind of deluding themselves in that certainty. And so, as far as like these approaches to information provenance and tracking, they're all well and good and valuable, but that's more incremental kind of stuff that isn't new in a sense, Mm-hmm. I mean, the consensus that they use to kind of reconcile things, fine, whatever. But, where, having unique digital property that's provably scarce, where that takes us exactly, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah, I think over the next 5 years, we'll see a lot of people trying. It's like we've got the solution, now they want the problem for it.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah. Yeah. Like, one thing I don't really understand, and you kind of mentioned you want to talk about maybe stable coins, and I don't really understand the point of stable coins, and so in a certain sense, like, I don't exactly know how you should regulate them, right? And or central bank backed digital currencies. It's like, why? Like, the dollar is already digital, practically speaking, right? I mean, how many of us are really paying with cash all the time?
Yeah, yeah.
Probably not enough.
Yeah, I think that I saw an article the other day too saying where's all the cash gone, and like it's just out of the system now, and they don't even know where it all is. But
Yeah, it's funny. That's kind of the flip side of this of the Pandora's box that Bitcoin has opened, right? Now all of a sudden these technological tools are being developed that can potentially enable transactions that wouldn't have occurred otherwise, and people will have more kind of control over their wealth and all sorts of other things. But if everything's on the blockchain and traceable, well,
privacy.
exactly, the privacy doesn't exist. Law enforcement loves Bitcoin.
Yeah.
A lot of people think it's the opposite, and it's like, why wouldn't they? You've got an audit trail right there, and of course, with mixers and kind of other things, and if you're really savvy and know what you're doing, you have a much better chance. But
then your coins, once they've gone through a mixer, a lot of exchanges won't accept them, so you can never cash out of them. Like it's
right.
It's challenging. I think that's where the digital, like the US digital dollar or something, would be implemented not as a freedom tool, but as something, they can see exactly how much taxes you owe and they can take it right out of your wallet, or, things like, I think it'll make it a lot easier for the government to exert, their power. If you have a speeding ticket or something, they could just take it straight from your wallet when the camera, my husband got a speeding ticket going 35 miles an hour. Yeah, the other day we got it in the mail. In the school zone, but there was the photo of it, there's no other car on the street, and it was, anyway, it made me really upset thinking at 35 miles.
Yeah, right.
Okay, but that's where I see the stable coins taking us, is to a really public financial state. I guess maybe can we touch on yesterday's Hester Peirce proposal? What do you think of that?
Yeah, fine. Okay, just first off, I don't think it's actually ever going to be implemented and become law, right? It's just a proposal that she's put forward. It's not even SEC guidance. It's not, it has no force of law whatsoever. But it's very much something that the community is excited about. Rightly so. And I do think there is something to the argument that, people innovating in a brand new space should have some sort of leeway. I don't know exactly what the boundaries of that necessarily are. And I think I saw somebody say on Twitter they were like, well, no, I guess it was actually my partner, Zach. He was saying that, like, man, if you thought 2017 was crazy, like, what are people going to do if they think, oh, we have 3 years of like get out of jail free, right? Like, I don't know. I think that, and I'm not a securities lawyer, and I had no intention of like trying to bone up and become one. I've been writing in this space for long enough and been involved long enough that I've learned enough to be dangerous and know that I don't want to do that work. So I'm sure there's finer points and kind of concerns of the potential incentives. I know that Commissioner Peirce put out the actual like transcript from the speech earlier today, I think, and I'm just kind of too busy to review it. And the reaction is more or less kind of in line with what I expected and kind of where everybody already was. People that are very pro-token are like, this is perfect. It's going to bring the industry forward. It's going to maintain the US's lead or position and kind of where everything is. And, so in that sense, like, I don't think we need to necessarily know anything new. I am sympathetic just in that it is hard to build a business, and it's hard to build a business in a new industry. But, I feel like I've been pretty consistent in that law tailored to technology is often bad law. Law that goes after particular behaviors that we as a society collectively through our representatives want to regulate or outlaw is much more effective and much more flexible. Once you start pigeonholing yourself to a particular definition of a technology, things can get real messy real fast. That's why like a lot of these proposed and passed state blockchain bills, define a blockchain as like basically every single buzzword you can think of related to the technology in the definition. And it's like, well, that's not clarity. or is that, and that's not even necessarily, like room to breathe, like if you have a client come in and be like, well, what does it say? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, it's a decentralized, distributed, electric, but not also electric, and it has smart contracts and token economics, but not token economics. And it's like, well, this is just word salad.
Yeah, especially when they put the decentralized part in there, because then it really only limits it to, it doesn't accomplish, like, I don't, Bitcoin already isn't regulated in a lot of these state issues around securities. And when they're, as soon as they're saying decentralized, like, that's really, the proof of work coins might be the only ones that are getting covered by these definitions. And they're the ones that are already outside the securities definitions from the get-go. So it's it's been
and that's
fun watching it all develop, though.
Well, and that's kind of another thing that I guess I've always felt is like, well, you can just start a proof of work style coin and be one of the first miners and make money that way if the network catches on, but not everyone necessarily wants to do that. You don't necessarily get the same status. You don't necessarily get the same financial rewards, and, all sorts of these kind of like human status things that we like to think we don't go after that, impact decision making and everything else and technical outcomes as a consequence. So
yeah, that's a good point. I think I do like the proposal. I hope it passes, because I have come across a lot of people trying to do their token, and whether it's a good project or not, from my my interactions with them, I don't believe they're thieves. I think they are they're trying to stay within the bounds. I don't know if what they're trying to sell is going to be something that's useful or not, but they don't seem to have bad intentions. But they have to go through this whole Reg D process, and then there's no aftermarket for it. So it's really a sticky spot right now with it, where you get the people that, I mean, we haven't really seen any ICOs, in the last little while, but at the time it was the people would either not follow the guidance of the regulations and just do an ICO, not collecting KYC, and then pray that they don't get caught, or follow this other path where there's really the tokens are kind of useless if they're securities, until the infrastructure to sell these security tokens really opens up. So I guess it's good. I can think of a few people that would have benefited from this kind of safe harbor. Whether their investors would benefit from buying the token or not, I don't know. But yeah, it'll be interesting. And then to see what qualifies as sufficiently decentralized or network maturity at the 3-year point will be an interesting set of criteria. I hope there is a clear cut, way to, like, some kind of minimum trading volume or something like that required, so that people know if they can hit it or not. But
I mean, philosophically, it is a little bizarre to me to kind of see this desire for like really proactive like regulatory framework from a community that in many ways is trying to, opt out or build like a parallel kind of financial system to the existing one. But you outlined some really good points as to, why it could be potentially beneficial and everything else. But at the same time, do we really do that for other industries? And to what degree, and is this industry, is it really necessary? I don't know. Maybe it is, and the people that are, trying to build token companies, which really need it to get going. And there is a concern as, well, the U.S. is going to fall behind, and all the innovation is going to happen in Asia or elsewhere. And maybe, have we really seen, mass adoption in China or South Korea? No. Right? And I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I'm just kind of like, all right, well, yes, I'm a big believer in the technology, generally speaking, and its long-term future. But, like, what's actually going on right now? Like, are people really being hindered? Oh, well, people are going to leave the United States. And it's like, okay, well, some people will, but, I don't know that that's necessarily true.
Agreed. Yeah, I think the main purpose of all this so far has been like speculative trading, and that's about it. But it'll be, maybe it starts there, and maybe we just don't know what the future of it is going to be applied to. It'll keep growing. So
yeah.
One other thing I wanted to ask. So I think there's a big Chicago lawyers community around the Bitcoin blockchain space, and I think you kind of spearheaded that. And can you tell us a little bit about that
Sure.
community and the benefits of it?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if I spearheaded it, but I did start a meetup group, which has been kind of dormant since I think last October, because I'm one of the co-organizers of the Block Legal Tech Conference, which is a blockchain law focused conference. We did it. Commissioner Peirce actually talked about this idea of safe harbor in October when she was the keynote for the conference. But I started the group back in April of 2018, I think, because there wasn't a group that really existed. One of the biggest, if not the biggest, kind of Bitcoin focused meetups actually started here in Chicago. It's called Bob. It's a Bitcoin Open Blockchain meetup. And Bitcoin Mom, if you follow her on Twitter, she was one of the co-founders of it. Pamela Morgan, who's an attorney who used to be based out of Chicago, and then I think Pamela just like travels everywhere now at this point. But that has like maybe 2,000 members or something. But I started Blockchain Lawyers of Chicago. There's now over 500 members, and yeah, it was just kind of initially a networking, like, I know there's other attorneys here because I was like the crazy Bitcoin person in my office, right? And I was like, well, I know there's other crazy Bitcoin people in their respective offices, and we should all get together and have drinks. And so that was just kind of how it started. And then, you know, we've had a variety of speakers over the past year and a half, 2 years that it's been going on. And I actually plan on starting it back up. I was going to reach out to a criminal defense lawyer that I know who's actually represented some people in crypto-related cases, just to kind of have him, come in and scare everybody straight. No, not really, but just talk about his experience with the community and everything else, because he's coming at it from a very different perspective, than I am, as just like a transactional lawyer, kind of trying to help grow businesses. So, yeah, I think that lawyers do themselves a disservice by not engaging with this community and thinking it's too complex and it's not something that they can understand. I think conceptually they definitely can. There's just obviously a lot of technical jargon and everything else that's involved in it that scares them away. But I think once you kind of start reading about this and you grasp the idea of the digital scarcity behind these systems and kind of the censorship resistant nature of tokens and kind of everything else, for most people it kind of clicks, like, okay, that might be valuable. There is another, and this is kind of diverting from the group, but there's another problem in that, like, those of us here in like the first world, it's kind of hard to grasp like why these systems have inherent value, right? Because by and large, like the financial system here functions. Now you can quibble, or not quibble, you can argue if it functions well for the majority of people or not. But like most people in the US are just fine with their credit cards, right? They're like, well, why would I have like a hardware wallet and lose all my money? That's make intuitive sense to them. But if you're from a country where there isn't really a working financial system and it's corrupt, there's tons of corruption and everything else, and now you're like, wait, I can opt out of that and just actually be in control of well, that is a much easier sell, right? So that's, there's, as I said, the group is kind of on hold, and there have been a lot of, there's always blockchain programming, in actually Commissioner Peirce just announced the framework here in Chicago yesterday at a conference. And so I think there's a lot of lawyers that are interested here, which is great. And yeah.
I read some communication on Telegram in one of the legal groups where they were talking about starting an SRO out of Chicago for the blockchain space. Is that something you've been involved with at all, or?
No, I think I remember seeing that in one of the groups. I like only log into Telegram like once every week or something, and then there's like 5,000 messages, and I'm just like, why am I even putting my but I think I remember seeing that, and I haven't been involved with that. There's a company here who has done. They're focused on trying to build infrastructure for security tokens, and their name, I can't think of their name right now. And I think those guys are definitely involved in it. And yeah, self-regulation from industry that is properly papered up and, you know, shows that people are trying to do the right thing, everything else is always good, right? You know, and the government wants to see that too, because, you know, they're not always super equipped to handle fast moving tech developments and everything else. And then once you start dealing with money and, you know, digital value, things get dicey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true.
So,
well, this has been very informative to me, hopefully to everyone
good.
else that listens as well. You have a really great way of explaining, you know, very complex things, probably from your years of teaching now.
Thank you, Sasha. Appreciate it. Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on, and, you know, I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Oh, great. Wonderful. And as if people don't know, you have a really active and also very informative Twitter account, but where can people find you?
Sure, yeah. So I'm on Twitter at Nelson M. Rosario. That's Rosario. And I try and keep it equal parts irreverent and equal parts informative, which is more or less exactly how I am in real life, which has come as a surprise to some people. So yeah, Nelson M. Rosario at Twitter.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much, Nelson, and
Yep,
have a
you're welcome.
good weekend.
You too.
Stuff.